this coming Friday, I should have been starting out on this route of the Pyrenees, a tour of a month. I would have been taking the ferry to Bilbao. However, I've had to cancel it. And I want to tell you the story of that because there's, I think, some useful lessons both in cycling terms and planning terms, but also in terms of health. So just to summarise, what happened is on Wednesday I went out for a very intense cycle to check my fitness. So today's an extremely challenging day. In order to kind of confirm that I'm fit enough to attempt the Pyrenees, I'm attempting to do about 90 kilometers, about 1800 meters of climbing on low assist mode, which is overkill. I don't expect to have to use that, but if I can get most of that distance done, I'll then have quite a bit of confidence. On Thursday, I got a notification from my watch that it thought it had detected arterial fibrillation. That's a heart condition. Friday morning, I went in to see the doctor, and 2 hours later, I was essentially being rapidly brought through accident and emergency and through one of the busiest hospitals in Dublin into the resuscitation room because they were clearly worried I was about to have a heart attack. I did get out of the hospital Friday evening. I'm now on medication, but as you might guess, setting it off on a 2,000 kilometre cycle that involves a lot of very intense climbing, you can see that in the lower part of this frame, would perhaps not be the smartest thing. So I'm not doing that. So I want to go over some of my planning, why in fact I've ended up not really losing any money, at least on this. I was nearly able to recover all the deposits I had paid out. The sort of way, the way I detected the problem, in the sense that I deliberately pushed myself to discover that, and also, and this is the kind of tougher part, what my options might be in the future. Is this going to end my ability to do cycle touring altogether? I'm hoping not. May I have to make some pretty drastic modifications to what I do, i.e. those long days doing a lot of climbing in the mountains that I really, really love. Maybe that's not on the agenda anymore. Maybe there is. I'll talk a bit about some of my options around that, and where things go from that. And if you if you've come across this channel and you're going through the videos and this is the last one, well then maybe things didn't turn out so well for me. If that is the case, I did want to just say, don't take that too badly. I've lived a good life. I've done a lot of things. I've probably had the adventures of 5 or 6 other people. So, you know, if this is a not great ending, and I don't think it is. I think I'm going to be grand. I think I'm just going to have to be careful. That's okay as well. But anyway, let's start by talking about some of my preparation for the tour. I was in two minds about recording this video, but then I realised that one of the things I know from people's comments on my videos is that a fear of going wrong, things going wrong, is often what stops people going on tours, or it's the thing they worry about the most in advance of them. And this is quite a good example of how things can go wrong. And not so much being on tour, but in advance. What happens if you need to actually cancel? And I think that's actually a good thing to talk about, because even in terms of my own processes, generally in January I'm kind of going, I want to go somewhere, but I'm humming and hawing about it and overthinking everything. And so what I make myself do is book my initial ferry tickets or train tickets or whatever to my starting point. And then once I've done that, that puts me in the mindset of starting to plan everything out. So that's exactly what I did this year. I booked a ferry from Rosslare to Bilbao in the Basque Country, heading over June the 6th, that's next Friday, and coming back, I think it was July the 6th, more or less a month later. I knew I wanted to cycle the Pyrenees, so then I opened up the Cycle Travel website, which I use for planning routes, and it's pretty good. You basically put your starting point, you put an end point. In this case, I picked the furthest east point I was probably going to do, and then you hit return journey, and gives you a sort of crude loop. And then I started altering that loop based on zooming in on the map and going, oh, there's a back road here that I want to do. This one's marked as a cycle track. This one's a bit famous, or whatever else. And so that process gives me a rough, I think it was about 1900 kilometer loop. Next stage is arriving on the ferry, I go, okay, how much do I think I can cycle on this particular day? And say I settled on, I think, about 70 kilometers, and then I used booking.com to look for a place that would be about that distance, and would be, it would preferably have a booking policy that, importantly, enables you to cancel quite a short period beforehand and get a full refund for doing so. And as we know already, that turned out to be very useful to me. You can't always find that, but you can often find ones that at least only take maybe half your money early on. The other thing is you normally can't find one that's at the 70 kilometers. You then end up needing to do 80 or 90 kilometers or whatever else. Now, I would say some people are very much into the idea of contacting places through their own websites and stuff, but I think the planning process of that, if you're booking 28 nights accommodation and you're somewhere different nearly every night, is pretty exhaustive, particularly if you don't actually have the language or much of the language of the place you're going to, which is my case. It's kind of handy having everything listed in one place and having an interface that's based on English and a standard procedure for deposits and everything else. Booking.com, it's not an endorsement. There's some ways they're not great at all. For one thing, I think, like Airbnb, they allow listings in the occupied territories in the West Bank in Palestine, which is not good at all. Lots of people would boycott them on that basis alone. And the other thing is the customer service is not good. The only real cases I've had where I kind of needed to do it is occasionally you get activity that looks fraudulent on those systems. Typically, someone tells you have 4 hours to pay a deposit on an external link website. That looks dodgy. I've reported those on 3 occasions. Twice I've got no reply from Booking.com whatsoever, and once they kind of asked me for some details I thought about my booking that I thought would have been on their system, and then never got back to me. Now, I didn't lose any money on any of those, probably because I didn't click on those links and pay money through it. But even though I use the system a lot, they promote you to different genius levels, which give you discounts, and I'm at the top available level because I've used it quite a lot. But even in my case, they were very unresponsive. So that's the problem with it. But on the other hand, it's a very easy single point stop. And as I found with this trip, when I was in a hospital on Friday, I realised that all the medical staff were taking things very seriously, so I probably needed to as well, and therefore that the trip was going to be off. I said, okay, tomorrow morning I'm going to wake up and I'm going to get on and just go through it and cancel everything. I did that. 16 out of my 21 nights were fully refundable. One night was booked somewhere else where there wasn't a deposit anyway. And actually, the remaining 4 places, I sent them a message explaining what had happened, and they all gave me a full refund anyway. So in other words, my accommodation costs, which was a potential loss of about, I think probably about €1,800 or something. So I found lots of cheap accommodation, €40-50 a night, which is why I was doing that kind of hotel and B&B style stuff. But yeah, it would still have stung if I'd have lost that. Because I booked the ferry back in January, I got the early booking whatever deal or whatever, which has flexibility. Now, because the first sailing, I was cancelling it less than a week before it was happening, I didn't get a refund on that, so I lost about 90 quid, I think, on that one. But they did give me half a refund on cancelling the second one, which actually still ended up costing me about 90 quid because the sailing back in July was almost twice as expensive as sailing over in June. I think if I'd booked earlier, it might have been a bit cheaper. So, again, a good argument for getting over your procrastination early on. January, probably December or November will be better at making a booking. But anyway, that's my basic route planning. It's exactly the same thing I did in Spain last year. As you're booking places, you obviously are then adjusting your route a little bit because often the place isn't exactly on the route, it's a little bit off it, and you need to make adjustments around that. You might also realise there's some amazing thing that you're going to be cycling right past or quite near, so you might want to divert to something like that. And this year, for the first time, what I had done is of my 28 nights, 4 of them I was spending 2 nights somewhere, so I would have recovery nights. Didn't do that last year, cycling around the Cantabrian Mountains in Galicia, and that was a bit of a mistake, although I made the whole thing. But that was the setup. So that's a way you can do if you're doing a cycle tour somewhere where you can afford the hotel accommodation cost. Not something I was able to afford in either Ireland or Scotland to do every night, so I mostly camped on those trips. It's a way you can actually plan the whole thing out in advance, so you don't need to be worrying about that on the road and spending a significant amount of time trying to find some of the following night. And actually, if you're going through isolated regions like parts of the Pyrenees, it could be you wouldn't be able to find something. So it probably wouldn't be a great way of doing it. But it's a way of doing it so that if something does go wrong, and it certainly went wrong for me, you'll probably be able to recover almost all your costs. And that's something you don't need to think about too much. And the important thing about not needing to think about it too much, not needing to worry about it, is it means you probably will make that booking back in January, and you will actually go. Where, double thinking this sort of thing is the sort of thing that can stop you going. The only other thing I would say is I very much prefer Booking.com over Airbnb, for instance, because what you're mostly finding on them are the sort of small family hotels or pensions that are, typically kind of like, 6 to about 20 rooms or whatever. Often the person when you arrive that you'll be talking to is the actual owner. They're not big chains, and it's not the Airbnb problem of where it's actually an apartment that otherwise could be rented out to somebody local to actually live in. In a lot of the Irish tourist towns and in Dublin, in fact, as well, that's a real problem in terms of housing, that there's a lack of affordable rents, but at the same time there's lots of short-term letting on Airbnb type sites, so that's also relevant to that equation. But as I said, definitely ethically suspect around Palestine, so that might be something you want to check out for yourself. Apologies for my mispronunciation of what I think should be atrial fibrillation all through this video. It's new to me, so I'm just learning it, and I may still be mispronouncing that a bit. Um, if you want to have an idea of what's happening with me right now, and I am doing some cycling, if I am, check out my Instagram, which I post stuff to pretty immediately, which is also called e-bike touring life. My TikTok there as well that I post stuff to, and more recently a Facebook page, all with the same name. I use those for more immediate stuff. This YouTube channel I edit videos for, and that generally takes me quite a bit of time. As I was saying, I do have a fair amount of footage and content in the bag already from this year. That's cycling around Kerry and Limerick, and also those Wicklow Mountain cycles. So they should appear. If I'm lucky, they won't appear for quite a while because I'll be able to get back on the road again. Uh, and if I'm not so lucky, then I'll be able to edit them over the summer, and you'll get them sooner. But so do give the channel a follow if you haven't already, and do give this video a thumbs up to help get it out to more people. As I said, if you've any knowledge of this yourself, do post it into the comments, and on the video description I'll stick a few links in, including a link to the route I had planned to take in the Pyrenees. So if any of you really mean you can do the identical one. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the other form of preparation, which is your physical fitness. If, like me, you have an office job, I cycle to work, but I don't do a lot of cycling over the winter otherwise. So you face the challenge, if you want to do a long tour, that you don't want to be going from doing 10 to 20 kilometers a day, which is what I would normally be doing on relatively flat terrain, to trying to cycle day after day 70 to 100 kilometers, where you're doing maybe 800 to 2,000 meters of ascent, which I would have been doing in the Pyrenees. A couple of days even more than that, actually. I think about 2,400 meters. That would probably not work well for you, even if you're on an e-bike, and certainly not if like me, you're a little bit older. So what I did this year, and not that dissimilar from last year, is I went out initially for a couple of longer one-day rides. I'd go up the Dublin mountains because there's some proper hard, steep ascents in there. And then about 2 months back, I was lucky and I spotted a much younger cyclist who partially inspired me to take up touring myself, called Saoirse Potty. She's quite big on Instagram and stuff as creating content, but she decided to try and organise a group bike packing weekend in the Wicklow Mountains, and advertised that. I spotted it when it went up, and I thought, oh, this is perfectly timed. It's about 2.5 weeks before I'm going. It's mountain stuff, and I was kind of curious as to how I'd get on with a group of people, because I've always done this solo. That solo thing is perhaps one thing I might need to change, because obviously if there's a percentage chance of medical complications when I'm touring, it'd be useful to have somebody with me who actually understood what was going on and could explain it to medical people. But anyway, let's leave that aside for the moment. We'll get into the medical side as I talk about the preparation. So that weekend was great. The first day, which was actually just me cycling to the meetup point, nearly killed me. I went up an incredibly steep hill called Red Lane. That was coming out of the hill between Bray and Greystones. For those of you who know Dublin and cycle around there, if you cut across there to the shoulder of the Sugarloaf, you'll come across it as you you'll come to that hill as you cross the N11, basically, and very, very steep ascents coming out of it. And then if you go left as you're going up it, there's a very gravelly it is a road, but it's a very broken up road that's even steeper, that gets you up to the top. Now, I found that quite tough, and retrospectively, I think I possibly was finding it tougher than I should have. So, I think this is one of the toughest hills I've ever done. It's a very, very steep ascent for a couple of kilometres. It's not that comforting to have dogs barking at you either. But we must go on. It might be, when you look backwards, you're like, oh, I wonder if that was a clue that something was up and up. But anyway, I made it up. The next day we did, I think, 1,300 metres, basically cycling from the campsite, which is Wicklow Way camping near Lough Dan, down into Glenmalure, then up the hill the other side. I've never done that before, and then around into Rathdrum, and there's lots of hills on that route. It's a nice route to cycle. I'd recommend it. Till we were, I think it was TP Adventures Ireland, which is quite near Rathdrum. Incredible campsite in some woodlands, some big pine tree woodlands. They have a sauna, and they do wood-fired pizzas, so that was great. And then the next day we cycled back via Lara and the Sally Gap, and down again. So that was great. That was my first 3 days. Little bit tough. The first day was the tough day. As I said, I'm kind of retrospectively wondering if maybe something was going on there. Did the other 2 days okay. And then a couple of days later, I had time off work booked already, and I went down to Kerry. And if you're in Ireland, this is that period we had in mid-May where the weather was actually amazing for about 8 or 9 days. I was really lucky and privileged to spend that 8 or 9 days cycling around the Kerry Mountains, then up Eurovelo 1 through Limerick City. Again, fantastic trip. I did the Gap of Dunlow, the Black Valley. If you're familiar with Ireland, these are amazing cycles. Mall's Gap, Kenmare, down the centre of that peninsula to Waterville. There's 3 great passes on that, including Mall's Gap. And then around to Inch Beach, Dingle, the Kerry Cliffs, on the way. 3/4 of the way up, and I decided it was a good moment to take a break. But I'm on the last section, which is just going up there behind me. Straight up. Good view from the top though. Loads of absolutely fantastic cycling, and managed to get in on the way back up the quite large greenway that connects. It's the old Great Southern Rail Line, and I did a short on that, explaining that the Kerry and Limerick councils haven't managed to actually agree a name or even a set of joint signs to tell you how long it is. But it's a nice, if you're looking for a nice greenway cycle, that's what it's doing. Just got back from that. We then had a spell of really not great weather, but it lifted. Last Wednesday it was going to be a bit better, and I went, okay, this is my chance to go up the mountains. Now, in the meantime, I had been looking at my route, and I had noticed a particular set of days where I was going to be staying in this mountain refuge at 2,000 metres, so really high up in the mountains. They just posted a photo to the Facebook saying the snow had melted on the access roads, and I realised they probably didn't have much in the way of electricity, if anything at all there, so I probably wouldn't be able to do a battery recharge. So I then went back and looked at those 2 days combined, and it's about 140 kilometers and about 3,000 meters of climbing. Now, this is exactly the sort of thing that triggers range anxiety if you're touring by e-bike, because you're going, oh, are my two 500-watt batteries going to be good enough for that? Now, anybody who's followed the channel in detail will know that I set up a custom low assist on my Nion controller, and that enables me to greatly extend battery range in conditions where I'm not sure if I've enough battery to cover it. So I decided last Wednesday I was going to go out, I was going to do a cycle in the Wicklow Mountains that was going to reproduce the first of the 2 days, and I was going to do that in the low assist mode just to confirm that the battery would last long enough for me to do that. So the cycle itself was funny because I was deliberately going up very steep climbs and then going back down again and then going back up again, one of those sort of things. Very exhausting on an assist level of 20%, which basically just compensates for the bike itself. Possibly it's you're even doing a little bit more work, and I really wanted to stay in that. I wanted to make it challenging, so I also did it in a single go without really taking a break. I mean, I stopped by the side of the road and ate a chocolate bar on the bike and drank some fluid a couple of times, but that was it. And did 65 kilometers and I think about 1,200 meters on that. That was a proper hard test. Got home. I was pretty exhausted, as you might imagine. I woke up the next day and my legs were stiff. And in fact, when I was at home on that Wednesday night, I did notice that my heart rate was staying high. Hadn't gone down to the sort of resting heart rate I normally have. And well, that's funny. I kind of just decided that was because of muscle damage in my legs, and I was working hard. So the system was working to repair all that, and that's why it was staying high. I mean, that's the kind of thing I think you tell yourself when you don't want to have bad news. So the next day, I'm a little tired, but that's not unreasonable given the effort of the previous day. And basically, it's only that evening that the problem starts, and it's not even a problem starting. So what happens is I'm just, it's about 9 o'clock at night. I'm lying in my bed scrolling the internet the way people do, and my Apple Watch suddenly flashes up a notification in red, telling me that it thinks it's detected arterial fibrillation. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. And that I should contact a GP if I haven't already been diagnosed with that. The wording of it is quite interesting because it's obviously designed to get people not to charge into accidents in an emergency really well, but to kind of go, no, you want to check this out. So, that an interesting balance, basically, of expressions. So I went, okay, I guess I better do that. And then I spent the rest of the evening Googling what is this thing, and it's basically where the top ventricle of your heart is beating out of sequence with the rest, which makes your heart beat faster, so that's why you get the elevated heart rate. It can also result in blood puddling in your heart, which can result in clotting, which, when you hear that, you're going, oh, okay, this is not good, because that can result in strokes, and it can result in heart attacks, particularly if this is happening over a protracted period of time. So definitely the case that I had to go in. I go into the I think it's the Grange Gorman, what do they call these? Community Health Hub or something, which is relatively close to where I live. And that's kind of lucky because those are big places with lots of doctors in them. They have a GP section, so they have lots of GPs. I should say I hadn't really any contact with GPs other than that since I was 25, and that's a very, very long time ago. I do have an ongoing eye condition, but I go directly into the eye hospital with that. So that's my kind of medical background to it, which is kind of relevant. In any case, I go in, the doctor looks at me, does the usual stethoscope stuff and says, well, we have an ECG here, I'd like to check you with that. So I go out, wait a while. Said, like, can you wait for that? And I was like, yeah. So there's a whole load of, it's just as well I took this decision and not that decision in this story. They call me back in after a while. They connect me up to somebody else connects me to the ECG. I go back in. She's looking at it, and she's going, yeah, this looks like arterial fibrillation, all right, but there's something else here that I don't really like. So I want you to go to accident and emergency, so that they can basically look at me with better equipment and somebody who's more specialised in this. And I was like, oh, you mean you want me to go now? And she's like, yeah, I want you to go now. And I said, okay, can I cycle down? He said, no, I'd prefer if you didn't, just in case. Is there somebody who can bring you? And so I rang home, got one of the people I live with. They came down, they drove me down. And at this point, I'm going, oh, this is kind of not looking very good. I go into accident and emergency in the Mater Hospital. If you know Dublin, it's one of the biggest hospitals. It's also a particularly famous accident and emergency because it's often bedlam in there. It's in the city centre. I previously chipped an elbow about 15 years ago while cycling. Couldn't cycle anymore, got a bus, and as I was on the bus I was going, okay, this is probably broken or something, I better go into the hospital. But it was a Friday evening, so I went into that accident and emergency and was just sitting and waiting. And as I was sitting and waiting, I think 6 ambulances arrived, and they kind of gurneyed people really quickly through into the room beyond. The accident and emergency was packed, and I looked around and went, they're not going to have a look at me for hours here. So I went home and I went to the what are they called? The quick clinics that they have. There's one down in Smithfield, for instance, that are basically for broken bone type stuff. And that's much quicker the next morning. That was instant. So anyway, my point with that story is your normal expectation going in there is you're going to be sitting there a long time before anybody looks at you. And a long time can be 12 hours. It can be, it can be very long. So I'm in the queue to talk to the receptionist, 2 people in front of me, probably takes 5 minutes. I'm running the heart monitor on my watch, and it's telling me I'm at 155 beats per minute. I'm just standing there literally in the queue. Now normally I wouldn't be at 150 if I'd cycled 20 kilometers and I'd done a reasonable climb in that. Like 150 is proper exertion for me. So I was like, oh, okay, this is not very good. Got to the top, gave the receptionist a quick summary and the note from the doctor. She said, okay, take a seat. And I'm kind of going, I'm now going to be here a couple of hours. I better sit somewhere that if I keel over, people will notice. I'm literally sitting down a minute when I get called in. And the room is full of other people who are also waiting. So obviously somebody in there has taken a look at this and gone, whoa, okay. And so they ask me why I'm there, and I tell them the story about spotting it on the watch. And I can see initially everyone's kind of being, oh, God, bloody watches. Not necessarily taking that bit of aspect of it that seriously. They hook me up, and then suddenly atmosphere changes. A wheelchair is brought out. I'm put in the wheelchair. I'm brought, I'd say, about 50 meters into what I then realize is the resuscitation room. And it's pretty obvious they're worried I'm actually quite close to having a heart attack, so they put me in there so that if I do, they can resuscitate me easily enough. I won't go through the entire process, but basically doctor comes in, talks to me, they put me on a drip. After about an hour, I think they decide I've stabilised enough that they move me into a ward. I'm attached to more ECGs are run on me. I'm sent for X-rays. There's, I think, about 8 different blood samples. Might have been more taken. So I'm kind of going, I think I'm going to be here for the weekend. Long story short with this, I'm not out. I don't get out of the hospital until about 9 o'clock that evening. And I have a prescription with me for blood thinners and for beta blockers. And if you know anything with sort of the heart condition stuff, you're going, okay, this is, they're both not only serious enough for themselves, but actually they're also the sort of stuff that quite affects your ability to cycle. Well, blood thinners, if you have an accident, you're going to bleed a lot more, which could be bad news, obviously. And beta blockers, that basically blocks adrenaline receivers in your body, which lowers your heart rate, which means you can't really do strenuous stuff. Like, you just can't do it at all, obviously. And so I had with that first doctor, the GP, I'd said, just as I was leaving, I said, one last question. I'm meant to be going to Pyrenees next week. I'm kind of presuming I should cancel that. You said, look, just talk to the heart doctor. And I'd said it to him again. I knew at that point. So I was well before I'd been released. I was in the mind of I'm going to have to cancel, and I've talked about how I did all that already. And so that's where I found myself. And now I'm kind of going, what does this actually mean for me? I've spent a lot of time cycling over the last 3 or 4 years. I only got into this a few years ago. I've really enjoyed it, but I also knew that because I'm getting older, there is heart condition in my family. That probably the number of years I could do the actual hard, strenuous stuff was limited anyway. And actually, it's the reason I decided to do the Pyrenees this year. I was initially considering another cycle in Spain that wouldn't have been quite so demanding. But I was kind of like, no, I won't put this off because I don't know how long I'll be able to do this for. So that's the position I'm in now. I'm looking at all of this and going, is all of this over? Now, in a way, this is where setting up the e-bike touring life channel actually helps me, because one of the things YouTube does is it gives me stats on my viewing audience. And it's very funny because my viewing audience is basically men who are aged between 55 and 85. And from the comments lots of you have left, I think part of the reason for that is quite a number of you are probably in a somewhat similar situation to me, where maybe you have been cycle touring longer, or maybe like me, you're taking it up, you're looking at taking it up. Your health is such that you can do it, but perhaps there's limitations on that. You should be sensible about particular things. And one of the most obvious things is that getting up very steep hills on a fully loaded bike is a hard thing that puts a lot of strain on the heart. So actually, if you can instead do that on an e-bike, that reduces that problem. Also enables you to do more range and stuff. So I kind of am in this situation now without that being the reason I started e-bike touring. The reason I started was more the fact that I wanted to be able to do quite ambitious tours, and as I said, my work and stuff doesn't enable me to maintain the level of fitness that would make that quite easy. So what are my options now? So first of all, I think the thing to say is I have to take that arterial fibrillation really seriously, not just because in this case maybe it was close to triggering a heart attack, maybe it wasn't, but it was serious enough that the people around me were taking it quite seriously. And there was a point that a consultant came in and he was up talking to the doctor. He did seem to be indicating that he was less worried because I didn't have other symptoms. But anyway, still something. I can't casually dismiss it, in other words. And I talked about all the training I did and how in effect, I'd probably triggered that through this particularly intense day. I'm kind of glad I did trigger it then, because I would have had as intense days in the Pyrenees, but I would have had those in the context perhaps where I was in the middle of nowhere. My language skills are very limited, probably a long way from any medical care that could have diagnosed me. And really, as I said, when I went into the GP, I a number of bits of luck there in terms of she took it quite seriously. She had almost immediate access to an ECG, which she was able to look at then almost immediately. And it was only at the point she was looking at it where she was like, there's a bit more going on here than just maybe there is, than the arterial fibrillation. So that's where I am. What can happen with arterial fibrillation is you can get episodes of it and then it can go away. Now I'm 3 days into this, and my watch has an ECG in it, which is kind of, how the hell does a watch have an ECG? But it does. You hold a finger on your other hand to the crown and it runs it. And I did that last night and this morning, and in both cases it said, this looks like you might have arterial fibrillation. If you haven't had a diagnosis, go and talk to your GP. So it's clearly still active, even if the medication I'm on now has it under much more control. It could stop in the next couple of days. Could be when I have a follow-on appointment next week. It could be when I do that, that they'll be like, oh, it's gone away. My father actually had it at a much older age than I did, and they were going to stop and restart his heart to get rid of it. But when he went in to have that procedure done, and they did an ECG in him. First they went, oh, it's actually gone by itself. Maybe that's one thing that could happen. That's certainly the outcome I would hope for. If it stays, then the problem is then you're staying on blood thinners and you're staying on the beta blockers, and that both limits the energy and also greatly increases the risk of injury. So particularly say if you think of something like a head injury and you've internal bleeding, if your blood's not clotting, that is a very, very substantially increased risk. That would really limit what I could do, in other words. If it's an episode, then I have the problem of, well, are there going to be more episodes? Now, I think I know what the trigger was for this episode, and I was dehydrated anyway coming out of the weekend. I think dehydration was probably a significant part, even apart from the exertion, so I could certainly be more careful about that. However, I was sort of trying to be careful with it, and in fact, the first day I've tried out electrolytes for that reason. And the other thing I started last year is I actually use the watch to monitor my heart rate when I'm doing strenuous things. And once my heart rate hits 160, then I take a break, right? And that's basically, you're meant to subtract your age from 120, and it's a bad idea to spend much time at a heart rate that's above that. So I kind of rounded up a little bit to be on the safe side, and I took a break. Now, I did, when I went back and had a look at the records in detail, actually did hit 170 at a point, because you can't always take a break at a particular moment, but I wasn't in that range for long. So those are kind of two obvious precautions I would be doing in the future anyway, and I was doing them anyway. So there is, what some people manage to do is they manage to get it so that they carry some of the medication with them, and then if they start to get symptoms or detection or whatever else, they take it and that gets it under control. It would be quite difficult, I think, to negotiate medical systems in isolated areas in another language, where you had to go through the whole thing, as I explained already. So that could be a limiting factor. So that would basically mean I'm never going to be able to do the Pyrenees on that level, and I think that's the reality. It might be too risky. It might also be that I decide, okay, I'm just going to accept this risk. I have done that. I took a lot of risks in my 20s and 30s when the number of years of life lost, or meaningful life, whatever they call that measure, would have been very much larger than it is now, because I'm older. Risk-taking is part, I think, of the story here, but I think you do have to calibrate that, and you have to think about what its impact would be on others. So perhaps that puts it out of range. Honestly, I think the likelihood is that's probably the case. I need to look at other things. However, there are some other things I can do. So one of the most obvious ones is the bike I have is quite a basic electric bike. It's an early Bosch engine on it. I think it only delivers either 40 or 45 nanometers of torque. If you follow the channel, you'll know back in the autumn I got the lend of a really fancy e-bike from Green Air for a few days, which I test rode, and it had either an 80 or an 85 nanometer torque. It's a recent Muller Super Delight, and going up a very steep hill on that was chalk and cheese with my other one. I did a little video segment where I cycled mine up, and I'm standing on the pedals and panting, and then I cycled the other one up, and I could sit down. It was much less strenuous. So in other words, an option for me could well be to upgrade to a more powerful motor that would give me a lot more assistance in the hills. There'd still be impacts on range and things like that. I'd need to deal with that, but that might put the Pyrenees back within the frame if I'm also fairly confident that this arterial fibrillation is not going to be a common event, that I understand what the triggers are, and that I can avoid the triggers. That's a possibility as well. And I guess the other one is, because it's not that I intend to give up entirely, is I just settle for more reasonable terrain, less mountains, very little mountains. I mean, I'm always on Facebook cycle touring groups. I'm always seeing people looking for flat routes, or talking about. I think it's cycling up the Loire Valley. Lots and lots of people do that in France, and it's meant to be very flat. And I've done the canals and one of the rivers here, and it's grand. And I kind of like it's. I really like mountains, so it's kind of tough from that point of view. But yeah, shorter distances, much more control of climbing. That's kind of, I think, where I am. I'm really hoping I don't end up in the near worst case scenario where I end up having to be on meds permanently, and that has a serious impact on limiting what I can do. Realistically, that might happen. Might not. I'm not going to get too stressed about thinking exactly what that is. I think that's outside of my control. I will find out probably over the next couple of weeks. Maybe I'll have a much better idea, and months. And next summer I'll either be able to do stuff that's quite ambitious. I'll have to scale things down a lot, or there's at least a danger that I'll actually not be able to do that much at all. I'll then have to find something else to do. However, in that context, this won't be the last video on the channel, because I have a few things I can talk about in terms of setup. I've a partial one, for instance, on how I video from the bike. That's an updated one that I have. I also have, I videoed both that Wicklow cycling I talked about, but also the Kerry Tour one. So I'll have day-by-day vlogs of that ready to go up. That'll take me a while to edit. If I end up being having to do less in the short term, then perhaps those will appear quicker. Otherwise, they may not start to appear until the autumn. But yeah, that's where I am. That's where I am with the channel. Thanks for listening to it all the way through here. To be honest, part of the reason I've done this channel, part of the reason I used a lot of political and historical writing previously, is that I find in the process of writing or talking for other people, that really engages my brain about all the possibilities around things, about what actually sounds sensible when you say it out loud, or what when you say it out loud you go, oh yeah, that's kind of delusional, you're just trying to fool yourself there. I haven't had too many of those moments in this. And I recognise that the problem I'm facing is probably very similar to the problems a lot of you are already facing or have faced, and you've adjusted your expectations around that, you've done planning. Really interested in anybody who has gone through that, or anybody with any medical knowledge, I guess. Let's emphasize that I don't have, I read science papers, I read medical papers, but I'm not, I worked as a hospital porter once. That's my level of, which is zero, by the way, of medical knowledge. So don't be taking medical advice from me, for God's sake. But, if you do, I'd be very interested to hear from people in any of those categories in the comments about what your experiences are, how you've adjusted to things. What does what I'm saying sound like? Do you think I'm being delusional about this? Do you think I'm being realistic? Am I being overly pessimistic? And I'm hoping things turn out okay for me. I'm hoping that I will be able to resume modified activity perhaps in next summer, but I'll still be able to do quite ambitious tours. And even if perhaps not so ambitious, perhaps keeping it more local, perhaps keeping it less on the hills, I'll still be able to do that. And if so, hopefully one day I will meet you on the road.